I just wanted to record a video to explain an argument that I've had for the existence of God. Now, this argument is something that I think, sort of thought of on my own. It's definitely related to the ontological argument, would be a form of the ontological argument. So, before we begin with the actual meat of the argument, let's just jump right into some explanations for the terms that exist behind the scenes. So a lot of these terms are going to be metaphysical terms that have definitions prior to, and we just need to explain. So the first difference is going to be between essence and existence. Now, everything that exists in the world, we can say two things, broadly speaking, about them. For one, they are, and for two, they are not like other things. So firstly, they exist, they have existence. And secondly, they have existence in a particular way. That is, existence is that something is, and essence is what something is. So, for example, a triangle has an essence of three sides, right? That's the definition of a triangle. A square has an essence of four sides. A human being has an essence of rational animal, or whatever else you'd like to use. The point being simply that every single thing has its own definition, and this becomes the essence of the thing. Now, just because something has an essence doesn't necessarily mean that it exists, right? Like, it's possible to theorize of a triangle without it actually existing. So that's the difference between essence and existence. The second distinction that I'd like to make is between valid essences and invalid essences. So whenever we think, we basically conceive of essences, right? Like, we conceive of the conception of a triangle. However, these conceptions can be valid or invalid based off of whether or not they contain logical contradictions. So for an example, a triangle is a valid essence because there's no contradiction within the idea, and it's very easy for us to talk about it. And when we think about it, we can come to real conclusions about the object without it ever actually existing. So for example, we can say that a triangle has 180 degrees of its internal angles added together. You know, it doesn't have to exist for us to say that, but we can determine that because it has a valid essence. However, an invalid essence is something that contains a logical contradiction within the idea, such that when we try and imagine it, it basically leads to a bunch of problems. So an example of this, a classic example, would be a married bachelor. Now, obviously, being a bachelor implies that you're a man that's unmarried, and marriage implies marriage. So there's a contradiction, which means anything we could say about the concept of a married bachelor is meaningless and it's invalid. We classify this as an invalid essence. Now, questioning an essence in particular is basically just asking whether or not an essence really is itself. So, for example, we might ask, does a triangle have three sides? This would be the equivalent of questioning an essence, and we'll get a little bit more into that later, but let's look at the proof. All right, so the first premise, an essence is valid if it does not contradict itself. Now, this is kind of what we just explained. I just wanted to put it into the proof formally, but yes, an essence is valid so long as it does not have a logical contradiction inside of it. Premise 2, questioning a valid essence is absurd. All right, this is what we were just getting into. So questioning an essence, like we just said, is to ask whether or not the essence really is itself. So it's like asking, does a triangle have three sides? So the answer to this question is contained within the question itself. So it might be more apt to say that this is a redundant statement or a redundant question, because asking the question, does a triangle have three sides, is equivalent to asking the question, does a three-sided object have three sides? Well, yes, obviously, because it's contained within the very definition of a triangle. So questioning a valid essence is absurd. But note here that we need to distinguish between the valid versus invalid essence, because if we brought back the invalid essence, this married bachelor example, then questioning the married bachelor leads us to basically a question mark, right? What's the answer to, is a married bachelor married? I mean, I don't know, because you'd seem to think it was married based off of the fact that the bachelor's married, but based off the definition of bachelor, I would think it's impossible for him to be married. So obviously we're just left with question marks. So this doesn't work with invalid essences. That's important. The third premise is that an essence of existence is valid. All right, now this is where we start to join in concepts to the notion of God. Because the classical definition of God, and I think I can cover this another time, is a being whose essence is existence itself, right? A being whose essence is simply existence, pure, unrestricted being. Now, the premise here is basically just saying that this is a valid concept. There's no contradiction within the notion of a God, a being whose essence is existence itself. So there's no logical contradiction within this idea, and so we can have this essence be valid and thus apply this proof to it. Now, this will get interesting later on. We can discuss whether or not there really is some sort of contradiction within the idea of God. But for the meantime, if this premise is true, then we can continue with the proof. So the first conclusion is that, therefore, questioning essential existence is absurd. Now, this makes a lot of sense because, like what we just talked about, any valid essence, questioning it is redundant, right? Does a triangle have three sides? That's redundant. Obviously, a three-sided triangle has three sides. Does a being whose essence is existence itself exist? Yes, obviously, because it's contained within the definition. So that leads us to the magical step, which is the second conclusion, which is, therefore, essential existence exists. What we just said, the special thing about existence is that instead of the triangle, where we got into this whole problem of, oh, well, since it's a triangle, therefore it must have three sides, because the definition of God is a being whose essence is existence itself, we can actually just say that he has to exist based off of his definition when we think about it ontologically. Because the definition of God is a being whose essence is existence itself, so now where does this leave us? Well, for one, I think that this argument is sound in that it's pretty simple, and it requires that if the skeptic, the person you're arguing against, is going to beat this argument, they would have to prove that God is contradictory, that essential existence is an invalid essence, and doing so puts the burdens on their shoulders rather than your own, which I think is quite useful. However, I do want to go through a few responses that I've sort of thought of, or I think that are kind of just like commonly used against ontological arguments, that are going to sort of need to be explained if this argument is going to hold any weight. And this is probably where most of the real purpose of the video comes into play. And we'll also talk about why I think that the idea of God doesn't contradict itself, and we can argue against that. So first off, the first argument that I could hear against this, which is probably the most common, is just to say that basically all of this is abstract and meaningless, and things like essences and existences aren't real, and that this is just a huge waste of time. Now, I have the most sympathy probably for this argument because it's quite authentic and it comes from people who are sort of laymen. But I do think that the response is quite simple, which is just to say that basically metaphysics underlies everything. Metaphysics is the study of first causes, things like being, change, time, essence, existence, etc. And so even the claim metaphysics is meaningless is in and of itself a metaphysical statement, because it claims that, being and time, etc., has no importance to human beings. And so obviously that is a claim about being itself, which is a metaphysical statement. And also, I think that an argument that begins with such basic concept as essence and existence stays away from some of the bad things that a lot of arguments in modern day have, which is that they use definitions of words that can be contested and are highly convoluted. This begins with basic concepts. And I don't think anyone can deny the fact that, one, everything that we encounter exists, and two, that it has a definition. Secondly, is the argument that existence is not a predicate. Now, this is an argument that you'd probably hear for someone who is like a first-year philosophy student, and this is an argument that basically gets explained to everyone in any philosophy program, but I think that it's really poorly understood, especially in this case. It's originally from Kant, and basically what Kant means when he says existence is not a predicate is he means that when we say that something exists, we don't predicate anything about the object itself. So, for example, if we were to say an apple exists, we're not predicating anything about the apple, right? Nothing about the apple changes whether or not it exists or it's just a figment of my imagination. Both things, in both cases, the apple is exactly the same. So when we say that, there's this thing called essential existence, Kant says, no, that's not a thing, because all you did was, use something that wasn't a predicate and make that the definition. And, since existence is not a predicate, it can't be an essential property. However, the response here is that while maybe existence isn't a predicate, necessary existence is. So let's take this apple example again. Let's change the definition of an apple such that the definition is now an apple is an apple, but it also must exist necessarily. So by its very definition, it has to exist. Now, if this is the definition of an apple, we've just changed a lot about it, because now an apple literally cannot be destroyed. And if an apple cannot be destroyed, clearly it's different from the apple that the rest of us know, and its properties have been changed in a major way. It becomes even easier to understand this if you think about it using, one of the other things that Kant says isn't a predicate. So he says that time and space also aren't a predicate, because whether an apple exists at 8:09 or 8:10 doesn't change the idea of an apple, which is true. But necessary temporality or necessary spatiality does change the definition of a thing. So if we said that an apple has to exist at 8 p.m. and at all other times it goes out of existence, well, we've just changed the definition of an apple. Think about a werewolf. A werewolf is a being who, if he exists, has to exist at midnight, has to exist at a full moon. A werewolf wouldn't be a werewolf if it had the ability to exist at times which, there wasn't a full moon. So clearly necessary temporality, necessary spatiality, and necessary existence really does predicate something about a being, and that's the whole point of this argument, to say that existence, essential existence, is a being. The third response that I hear, or I guess I could imagine hearing, is to sort of say, well, I agree with your entire argument here, but now let's posit that there's a being whose essence is existence at 8 p.m. So there's this being who necessarily exists at 8 p.m. And on first glance, I'm liable to agree with this argument. That is to say that there is a being who exists at 8 p.m. in the same way that there's a being who must exist at 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., 12 p.m., etc. However, if the skeptic means it in the sense that there is a being whose essence is existence itself, but only at 8 p.m., then clearly we've learned that they're predicating something about the being, right? They're not just saying that this essential existence that we've been talking about, this God, can exist at 8 p.m., which I think we all would certainly agree it can exist at 8 p.m., just like it must exist at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and 12 p.m. But now they're saying that this being, it's essential existence, but it can only exist at 8 p.m. And they could add any modifier that they want here, right? They could say there's this being whose essence is existence itself, but existence only at, 12 p.m., existence only in Idaho, existence only as a bear, right? There are all these ways in which they can change it, and they can sort of use our proof against us and say, well, this being is essential existence, therefore it has to exist. So via your own argument, there must be, a unicorn. There must be a being that only exists at 8 p.m., right? There are all these weird beings that clearly don't exist, and there's no reason for them to need to exist, that have to exist via your proof, and this could be used to justify literally anything we want. However, the response here is that what they've done really here is to create an invalid essence, right? So let's take this being whose essence is existence itself, but only at 8 p.m. So at any time other than 8 p.m., it goes out of existence, but for the rest of the time, its essence is existence itself. The problem here is that the two parts of the essence, that is to say pure existence itself and existence at 8 p.m. alone, contradict, because one limits the other. It's trying to access pure, unrestricted existence to prove it exists. This is a necessary part of the proof, but then also trying to reduce it. They're trying to use an infinite adjective and a finite adjective in the same sense. So let me give another example. Let's say that we had a being whose essence was infinity itself. And then let's say that we tried to say there's a being whose essence is infinity itself, but it only weighs 10 pounds and it only exists inside of Idaho at 3 p.m. Now, what we've just done here is clearly contradictory, because the essence would include both infinity itself, but then also a restricting adjective, which you can't have, right? How could you have infinity itself, but the infinity only weighs 3 pounds, and this infinity is limited to a certain space at a certain time, right? By the very definition of infinity, if we're going to have infinity in its essence, it has to exist totally unrestricted. And by restricting it in any way whatsoever, you've just created an invalid essence, an essence that contradicts itself. And remember our proof: if an essence contradicts itself, it is not a valid essence, and therefore it cannot be used in our proof. So going back to God, to say anything about God, to say that, essential existence exists as a bear, or to say it exists as a human being, or to say it exists as a star, or at 3 p.m., or in Idaho, is to restrict existence in some way. And to restrict pure being in and of itself is a contradiction. You're saying there's an infinite essential existence that exists, but it has to exist in this specifically constrained way. And that in and of itself is a contradiction, and so it is an invalid essence. The only essential existence that can exist is essential existence, pure stop. To say anything after that is to constrict and to sort of get rid of the infinity that exists within the very concept of pure unrestricted existence. And as such, the only necessary existence that exists in the world is a being whose essence is pure existence, full stop, with no additions. Now, the last response is going to be way simpler than that. I'm sure that was the most complicated one. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask me. But this is the argument that basically God contradicts, right? You could say, okay, your proof is really good, but the problem is that God is a contradictory essence, and therefore, you don't get access to him existing because his essence is not valid. Now, I think there are sort of two ways that I hear this formulated in general. The first way is to say that there's this being who's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, and this is, essential existence itself. This is God, right? God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent, whatever. And they say, okay, well, if your God is all good, he's all-knowing, and he's all-powerful, then why doesn't he stop bad things and evil that exists within the world? I think the answer here is fairly multi-pronged. There's a lot of responses that we can give. The first of which would be that he wouldn't want to constrain free will, because if God were to say, oh, well, human beings can't do bad things, nothing can do bad things, then he would eliminate all free will in the universe, and without free will, we can't have moral goodness. We can only have moral goodness when people choose to do good things. So if God wanted to make the best universe possible, he'd want a world with moral goodness, and you only have that when he has free will, and a consequence of that means that he has to allow evil to exist, but that's for the greater good. Secondly, is that when evil exists, it exists in such a way that it allows for a greater good to come about later. What's the point of glory? What's the point of anything, really, if there isn't struggle, if there isn't something evil to overcome in the first place? So I think the overcoming of evil is a necessary step toward good. So this is further proof that he wants goodness overall. And the last response we could give is we could say that if God didn't allow for evil in the world, he would be violating our human dignity. For God to create a being who has free will, and then to say, well, you're not allowed to have it, you're not allowed to use it. I think if anyone did that, we would say that that's tyrannical, that's evil, and the same would apply to God. And since God loves us, he wouldn't do that. He wants goodness for us. He gave us free will, and anyone who wouldn't want to get rid of that, or not created in the first place for that matter, is evil. Now, the second argument that I get against this as to why God contradicts, I think this one is probably the worst argument that I hear. And that is that basically because there's a big stone that God could make, he can't exist. So the argument is that can God create a stone that is, so big that he can't move it? And if he can't create the stone, then he isn't omnipotent. However, if he can create the stone, then he couldn't move it, so then he's also not omnipotent. So essential existence can't exist. It is an invalid essence because omnipotence would be one of its, traits, because, pure being would be able to control all of particular beings. That would be omnipotence, and since omnipotence contradicts itself, this being can't exist. And our proof fails. However, the response to this would be that the person who argues this really doesn't understand what we mean by omnipotence. When we say that God is omnipotent, we mean, like we just said, that he, as the source of all being, can control any being, right? He is pure existence, so he can control everything that does exist. However, this doesn't mean that he can do things that are logically impossible. So, for example, if you told God, can you please make me a square circle? God can't do that because a square circle is absurd, it's ridiculous, it can't exist, and so God doesn't operate in the world of logical contradictions. And in the same sense, the same applies to what the atheist just proposed with this immovable boulder. All matter can be moved, so to posit that there's some such thing as an immovable object is in and of itself a logical contradiction because all matter can be moved. That is part of the definition of matter. Now, I think one of the ways in which we can make this argument even better, and I think you can illustrate an even more funny way, is, it'd be like if you went up to God and you told him, can you make me something called Sneed? And, obviously God has to know what Sneed is. And so what's the definition of Sneed? And then you said, oh, well, Sneed has no definition. So, obviously God can't create something that has no definition. No one can, because there's a logical contradiction there. You can't will something with no definition. That's the very, very essential contradiction there. And as such, God wouldn't do that. He's still omnipotent, even if he doesn't act in terms of logical contradictions. This is the definition of omnipotence that Christians have used since the beginning, and it's the only definition of omnipotence that makes any sense. So overall, the last argument that I think we can make against God contradicting himself is to say that it just doesn't make any sense for this to be the case, right? God, as a being, gives rise to all of us particular beings. So what that means is that, I exist, you exist, all sorts of animals exist, and these are all particular beings with existence. And, insofar as they exist, we know they don't contradict themselves, right? An unmarried bachelor, by its very definition, it can't exist because it contradicts itself. But we don't contradict ourselves, and apples don't contradict themselves because they exist. And I'm not saying that human beings can't have contradictory thoughts. I mean, certainly we can. But, we don't contradict ourselves in our very being, right? And so if particular beings can exist, then the source of all being has to be able to exist, right? If individual beings can exist, then being itself, therefore, must be able to exist without contradiction. And this is exactly what God is. So I think the very fact that we exist suggests that there is no contradiction within God. But even if the atheist still finds all of these arguments poor and is unconvinced, remember that at the end of the day, they have to stake their salvation and their life and their entire position on basically hoping that God contradicts himself, and they have no solid evidence of that whatsoever. So at the end of the day, I'd say that even if they're not convinced, it would be foolish, I would say, to just simply not believe in him because they have an inkling that he doesn't exist, when they clearly have no proof of it. And very clearly there's strong evidence to the contrary, which I think we just presented. So overall, that would be the argument. It's just a simpler way of putting the ontological argument. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but that's all I have, so thanks for watching.